Boy inherits an old vase. What he discovered inside left. Everyone in shock. What would you do if the only thing you inherited from your wealthy grandfather was an old dusty vase? No houses, no money, just a fragile, forgotten relic. Would you toss it aside, or would you hold on to it, believing it might hold a secret? For young Ethan, what he found inside changed his life forever. Something so shocking, no one in his family saw it coming. Dear family, it's wonderful to see you all. We have viewers from all over the world, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave us a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories. Now let's get started. The heavy oak doors of the lawyer's office creaked open, revealing a grand yet solemn room filled with somber faces. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of grief and expectation hanging over the Whitmore family like a storm cloud. Outside the coastal town of Bar Harbor, Maine, was unusually quiet for a summer afternoon. Seagulls cawed in the distance, their cries carried by the salty breeze. But inside this room, time felt as if it had stopped. Ethan sat near the back, his fingers nervously tracing the grain of the wooden chair. At just 16, he felt like an outsider among the sharply dressed relatives who barely acknowledged him. His mother, Linda, perched at the front, her spine rigid, eyes sharp with expectation. She wore her best black dress, the one she reserved for occasions where appearances mattered more than emotions. His uncles and aunts murmured in hushed voices, some glancing at their watches, others exchanging knowing looks, their minds already fixated on the fortune they were about to claim. At the head of the table, the lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and a professional yet distant demeanor, cleared his throat. He adjusted the stack of crisp legal documents before him, then looked up. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice even and deliberate. "As you know, James Whitmore was a man of great integrity, generosity, and wisdom. It was his wish that his estate be divided according to the terms outlined in his will." Ethan swallowed hard. The mention of his grandfather's name stirred a familiar ache in his chest. James Whitmore had been more than just a grandfather. He had been his guide, his mentor, the only person who ever truly saw him for who he was. He remembered the long walks they used to take along the rocky shore, the smell of salt in the air as his grandfather shared stories of resilience, hard work, and the importance of believing in oneself. Ethan had clung to those words, storing them away like treasures. The reading of the will commenced, and with each name called, excitement flickered across the faces of his relatives. "To my eldest son, Richard Whitmore, I leave the family estate on Greenhaven Hill." A satisfied smirk spread across Richard's face as whispers filled the room. "To my daughter, Evelyn Carter, the commercial properties in downtown Bar Harbor." Another delighted nod, another hushed murmur. The assets were being distributed generously, houses, land, investments, all falling into eager hands. Ethan's pulse quickened as the list dwindled. His grandfather had never spoken of leaving him wealth, but surely he had left him something. He straightened in his chair as Mr. Caldwell paused, briefly adjusting his glasses before continuing. "And lastly," the lawyer announced, "to my grandson, Ethan Whitmore, I leave my most cherished possession, an old vase." Silence, then laughter. It started as a chuckle from one of his older cousins, but quickly escalated into full-blown amusement. "A vase?" Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "That's it?" Evelyn let out an exaggerated sigh, while another cousin whispered, "Maybe it's full of seashells from all those pointless walks he used to take." The remark stung, but Ethan didn't react. He kept his eyes on the lawyer, willing himself to stay composed. Linda, however, was anything but composed. "This is a joke," she spat, her face flushed with fury. "A vase? My son gets a worthless, dusty old vase while everyone else walks away with real assets? That's an insult." She turned to Mr. Caldwell, demanding, "Surely there's been some mistake." The lawyer remained unshaken, his gaze steady. "I assure you, Mrs. Whitmore, these are the terms of the will exactly as James intended." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint scratching of pen on paper as Mr. Caldwell signed the final page of the document. Ethan felt his mother's eyes burning into him. But he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he reached forward as the lawyer slid the vase toward him. It was smaller than he expected, its edges chipped, the surface dull with age. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried something more than just its physical form. His fingers traced the intricate carvings along its side, patterns that had faded over time, but still held a certain beauty. He recognized them. His grandfather had once told him they were symbols of wisdom, passed down through generations. Ethan's heart pounded. Why had his grandfather chosen this for him? Linda scoffed. "You don't have to take it, Ethan," she said coldly. "It's nothing but junk." Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted to believe that wasn't true, that James Whitmore had left him something of meaning. And deep inside, past the humiliation and confusion, a quiet voice whispered, "There's a reason for this." As he cradled the vase in his hands, the laughter of his family fading into the background, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to throw it away. The house that once felt like a home now felt like a battlefield. That night, the dim light from the kitchen flickered against the walls, casting long, distorted shadows. The ticking of the clock above the fireplace filled the silence between the waves of his mother's rage. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing down on Ethan like an unbearable weight. Linda paced back and forth, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. She had been seething ever since they left the lawyer's office, barely speaking a word during the drive home. But now she had reached her breaking point. "A vase!" she muttered under her breath, her voice shaking with fury. "A worthless, dusty old vase!" She stopped suddenly and turned to Ethan, her eyes burning with resentment. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for me?" she snapped. "Your grandfather left everyone else with real wealth. And what did you get? Some useless piece of junk. Do you know what that says?" Ethan sat stiffly at the kitchen table, the vase still in his lap. His fingers traced the carvings on its surface, over and over, as if they might reveal some hidden message. His mother's words cut deep, but he refused to let her see how much they hurt. Linda slammed her hands down on the counter, making the glassware rattle. "It says you meant nothing to him, Ethan," she screamed. "If he truly cared about you, he would have given you something of value. But he didn't. He left you a vase as if you were some kind of joke." Ethan flinched at her words, but he kept his gaze down, staring at the vase. He didn't believe her. He couldn't. His grandfather had loved him. He had to have had a reason. But Linda wasn't done. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head as she grabbed a bottle of wine from the counter and poured herself a glass. "I spent years taking care of him, years putting up with his old-fashioned nonsense, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd show some appreciation when he was gone. But instead, he gives his fortune to everyone else and leaves my son with trash." Ethan finally looked up. "Maybe it's not trash," he said quietly. Linda's eyes snapped to his, and for a moment there was something almost dangerous in them. "Oh, so now you're defending him? That man humiliated you in front of the entire family, and you're still acting like he did you some great favor?" Ethan didn't know what to say. He didn't have the answers. All he had was the weight of the vase in his hands and a gnawing feeling in his chest that told him he couldn't throw it away. Linda took a long sip of her wine, then exhaled sharply as if coming to a decision. "I'm done, Ethan," she said, her voice cold now, void of the earlier rage. "I'm not going to waste my time taking care of a son who meant nothing to his own grandfather." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" She set her glass down and crossed her arms. "I want you out of my house. Pack your things and leave by sunrise." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything she had said before. For a moment, Ethan thought he must have misheard her. His mother had never been warm, never been particularly affectionate. But this was something else entirely. "I have nowhere to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda shrugged. "Not my problem." Ethan's grip tightened around the vase. "You don't mean this," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew she did. Her lips curled into something that might have been a smirk if there had been any amusement in it. "I should have known he'd turn you into a fool just like him, clinging to some useless vase like it actually means something." Before Ethan could react, she reached out, grabbed the vase from his hands and hurled it across the room. Time seemed to slow as he lunged forward, his heart hammering in his chest. His fingers barely managed to catch it before it hit the floor. He cradled it against his chest, breathing hard, as if it were something fragile and irreplaceable. Linda scoffed. "Look at you," she sneered. "Pathetic." Ethan felt something snap inside him, but he didn't argue. There was no point. He rose from the chair, gripping the vase tightly, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the stairs. Behind him, his mother's voice rang out, sharp and final. "Be gone before morning, Ethan. I don't want to see you when I wake up." His legs felt like lead as he climbed the stairs to his room. The house around him, the only home he had ever known, suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if he no longer belonged there. Maybe he never had. Inside his small, cluttered room, he sat on the edge of his bed, the vase resting in his lap once more. The moonlight streamed in through the window, casting soft shadows over its worn surface. He ran his fingers over the faded carvings again, searching for something, anything, that would make sense of what had just happened. His hands trembled, his breath uneven. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. He was 16, and by morning, he would be homeless. Tears burned the back of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, he sat in silence, staring at the vase, waiting for the sunrise in a future he had never expected. The sky was painted in hues of deep purple and soft orange as the first light of dawn crept over Bar Harbor. The world was waking up, but for Ethan, everything felt like it was ending. He stood outside the house he had called home for 16 years, staring at its darkened windows, knowing he would never walk through that door again. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of the night, and a heavy stillness surrounded him. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore, a sound that had once brought him comfort when he listened to it beside his grandfather. Now it felt like a farewell. A worn-out backpack hung from his shoulders, carrying a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and a toothbrush. But the only thing that truly mattered was in his hands, the old vase. He held it tightly against his chest, afraid that if he let go, he might lose the last connection he had to his grandfather, the last piece of a life that had been ripped away from him overnight. He took a deep breath and turned away, stepping onto the empty sidewalk, leaving behind everything he had ever known. The town was just beginning to stir. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the corner bakery, mixing with the scent of damp pavement from the morning dew. Shopkeepers flipped over closed signs to open, their lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Ethan, everything had changed. He walked through the streets, his gaze fixed on the ground, avoiding the eyes of strangers. People passed him, businessmen rushing to work, parents walking their children to school, tourists with cameras slung around their necks. But no one noticed him. He was invisible. By midday, hunger gnawed at his stomach, a dull ache that grew sharper with every step. He had no money, no place to go, and no idea what to do next. He wandered through the park, watching a group of children laughing as they fed breadcrumbs to the pigeons. His stomach clenched at the sight of the food, but he forced himself to look away. The hunger became unbearable by evening. Desperation pushed him to do something he never thought he would. Behind a small cafe on Main Street, the scent of grilled sandwiches and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Ethan hesitated before slipping into the narrow alleyway, his heart pounding in his chest. A rusted metal dumpster stood against the wall, its lid slightly ajar. He swallowed his pride and stepped closer. The first thing that hit him was the smell, a rancid mix of old coffee grounds, rotting vegetables, and discarded meat. His stomach twisted, but the hunger was worse. He reached in, his hands trembling, rummaging past crumpled napkins and plastic containers until he found half a bagel with only one bite missing. His mouth was dry as he lifted it to his lips. "Hey!" The sudden voice sent a jolt of panic through him. Ethan whirled around, clutching the bagel in one hand, the vase in the other. A man in a dirty jacket leaned against the brick wall nearby, watching him with tired eyes. Ethan braced himself for anger, for mockery, but the man just let out a quiet sigh. "First time?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the vase. The man nodded as if he understood. "You'll get used to it." Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the alley. Ethan stood frozen for a moment before looking down at the bagel in his hand. This is my life now, he thought. This is survival. That night, exhaustion pressed down on him, heavier than his hunger. He found a small alcove behind an abandoned storefront, curling up against the cold stone wall. His backpack served as a pillow, but it did little to block out the chill creeping into his bones. He cradled the vase close, as if it could protect him from the world that had suddenly become so cruel. He didn't know how long he had been asleep when a voice stirred him. "You shouldn't be out here, dear." Ethan's eyes fluttered open. A woman stood in front of him, her presence soft yet commanding, like a grandmother who had seen too much of the world but still had kindness to spare. Her gray hair was tucked beneath a faded blue knit hat, and in her hands she held a steaming cup. Ethan sat up cautiously, his fingers still curled around the vase. He had learned quickly that kindness from strangers often came with conditions. The woman crouched down, holding out the cup and a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin. "Go on, take it. You look like you need it more than I do." He hesitated, then reached for the offering, feeling the warmth seep into his cold hands. He took a sip. Tea, sweet with honey. "Thank you," he murmured. She studied him for a moment before nodding toward the vase in his lap. "Strange thing for a boy to carry around," she remarked. Ethan instinctively pulled it closer. "It was my grandfather's." Something flickered in her expression. Understanding, maybe even recognition. She didn't pry, didn't ask why he was alone, why he looked so lost. Instead, she just gave him a small smile. "Sometimes," she said, "the smallest things hold the greatest secrets." Ethan frowned, glancing down at the vase. The carvings caught the dim glow of the street lamp above them, casting tiny shadows against the napkin in his lap. When he looked up again, the woman was already standing. "You take care of yourself now," she said, giving him one last look before turning down the sidewalk, her footsteps disappearing into the quiet night. Ethan watched her go, her words still lingering in the cold air. He traced the patterns on the vase again, as he had done 100 times before. What secret could it possibly hold? The days blurred together into a cycle of survival. Ethan quickly learned that life on the streets was not just about enduring hunger or the cold. It was about navigating an invisible world that operated by its own ruthless rules. The city, which had once been a familiar place filled with childhood memories, now felt like a vast and unforgiving labyrinth. He learned where he could linger without being noticed. The back steps of the library before the staff arrived, the quiet bench near the harbor where the morning sun provided a moment of warmth. He figured out which stores would toss out day-old bread, which alleyways were safest to sleep in, and which places to avoid at all costs. But nothing came without a price. One evening, as the last traces of daylight faded, Ethan sat on the damp pavement behind a diner, waiting for the moment when the kitchen staff would take out the garbage. His stomach was tight with hunger, his body sluggish from exhaustion. Every night was colder than the last, and every meal was harder to find. He shifted his grip on the vase, pressing it against his chest as if it could shield him from the reality of his situation. "Hey, kid." Ethan stiffened. Two boys stood at the alley entrance. He recognized them. Street kids, rough around the edges, older than him by a few years. They had the look of people who had been hardened by this life, who had long abandoned the idea of kindness. "That's a nice little thing you got there," the taller one said, nodding toward the vase. His tone was casual, but Ethan knew better. "What's inside? Got money stashed in there?" Ethan shook his head. "It's just a vase." The shorter boy smirked. "Then you won't mind handing it over." Ethan's grip tightened instinctively. "It's mine." The taller one sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Look, kid, you don't need it. You need food. You need warmth. We could sell that thing. Get enough for a real meal. You ever had a burger with actual cheese on it?" For a brief second, the temptation flickered through Ethan's mind. What if the vase really was worthless? What if he was clinging to something that had no meaning, when what he needed was to survive? But then he heard his grandfather's voice in his head. "Some things only reveal their worth in time." Ethan squared his shoulders. "I'm not selling it." The taller boy's expression hardened. "Suit yourself." Then he lunged. Ethan barely had time to react before the boy grabbed for the vase, fingers curling around its worn surface. Panic surged through him, raw and instinctive. He twisted his body, yanking it back, but the force sent him stumbling. His knees scraped against the pavement, the taste of iron filling his mouth as his lips split against his teeth. The shorter boy kicked him in the ribs, sending pain shooting through his side. "Just give it up, kid," he muttered. Ethan gasped, his vision blurring. He should let go. It was just an object, wasn't it? Just a piece of pottery. But deep inside, something stronger took hold. A feeling that if he let go of the vase, he would be letting go of more than just an object. With every ounce of strength he had left, he clutched it tighter and rolled away from his attackers. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline drowning out the pain, and ran. He didn't stop to see if they were following. He just ran, the weight of the vase grounding him as he weaved through the streets, his breath burning in his lungs. When he finally stopped, his body shaking from exhaustion, he realized he had made it to the harbor. The water stretched out before him, endless and dark, reflecting the city's dim lights. His legs gave out, and he sank onto the cold wooden dock, pulling the vase into his lap. His hands shook as he ran his fingers over its surface, searching for cracks, for damage. But it was whole, just like he was. Tears pricked his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, he pressed his forehead against the vase and whispered the question that had haunted him since the day he received it. "Why did you leave this to me, Grandpa?" The only response was the quiet lapping of the waves against the shore. The rain started as a light drizzle, tapping against the rooftops and slick pavement, before turning into a steady downpour. Ethan pulled his hood tighter around his face, his clothes already damp from the mist rolling in from the harbor. He needed to find shelter, fast. Most places were already taken. Doorways, bus stops, even the dry patches beneath the overhangs of buildings had already been claimed by others seeking refuge from the cold. His ribs are still sore after the fight earlier, and every step sent a dull throb through his side. He had nowhere else to go. Then through the curtain of rain, he spotted it, the abandoned pier. It had once been a bustling dock where fishermen brought in their daily catches, but now it was nothing more than a forgotten skeleton of wooden beams and rusted metal, stretching out over the black water. It wasn't much, but it would do. Ethan ducked beneath the rotting planks, his breath coming out in shaky clouds. The space beneath the pier was cramped and smelled of salt and mildew, but it was dry. He let out a sigh and slid down against one of the wooden posts, cradling the vase in his lap as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. He wasn't alone. A rustling sound made him stiffen. His grip on the vase tightened as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. Just a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows, a girl sat curled up beneath a tattered blanket. She looked younger than him, 15 maybe, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived far beyond her years. Strands of dark, rain-dampened hair clung to her face, and her sharp gaze flicked over him, assessing, calculating. "You always bring expensive pottery to the streets?" she asked. Her voice was dry, edged with amusement, but there was caution beneath it. Ethan hesitated. He had learned quickly that trust was not something to be given freely out here. "It was my grandfather's," he said finally. The girl let out a small, unimpressed hum. "And you figured the best place for it was under a pier?" He had no answer to that. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned back against the wooden beam. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant crashing of waves and the rain pattering against the dock above. Ethan let out a slow breath, exhaustion creeping over him. He should have been used to the cold by now, but it still settled deep in his bones, refusing to let go. "You got a name?" the girl asked after a while. "Ethan." She nodded as if deciding whether that answer was acceptable. "I'm Grace." Another silence, but this one felt different, less like a warning, more like an understanding. Grace shifted slightly, pulling her knees up to her chest. "Been out here long?" Ethan shook his head. "Couple of weeks." She let out a low whistle. "That explains why you still look fresh." Ethan frowned. "Fresh?" Grace gave a half smirk. "Give it time. This place wears you down, eats at you. You either get smart or you don't last." There was something in her tone that made Ethan look at her closer. The way she said it, It wasn't just advice, it was experience. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. Grace's smirk faded. She stared out at the rain for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Long enough," she said. "More than a year." A year! Ethan tried to imagine it. A year of sleeping on concrete, of scavenging for food, of feeling invisible to the world. He thought of the cold, the hunger, the way his own mother had thrown him out as if he meant nothing. He wondered if Grace had someone who had done the same to her. "You don't have anywhere else to go?" he asked carefully. Grace gave a short laugh, but there was no real humor in it. "If I did, you think I'd be under here?" Fair enough. Another gust of wind sent a chill through him, and Ethan instinctively curled around the vase, trying to preserve what little warmth he had left. Grace watched him, her gaze flicking to the object in his arms. "So," she said, "what's with the vase?" Ethan hesitated. He had been asked this question before. By his mother, by the kids who had tried to steal it, by himself every single night. But this time, it felt different. He looked down at it, tracing the intricate carvings with his fingers. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't let it go." Grace studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Guess we all carry something, don't we?" Ethan glanced at her, and for the first time, he noticed the way she clutched her blanket like it was the only thing keeping her together. She looked away first. "You planning to stick around?" Ethan thought about it. He thought about the nights spent alone, the fights, the hunger, the aching loneliness of wandering a city full of people who never even glanced his way. He exhaled. "Yeah, if that's okay." Grace didn't answer right away, but after a moment, she scooted over just enough for there to be space beside her. "Just don't snore," she muttered. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and settled down beside her. For the first time since he had been thrown out of his home, he didn't feel entirely alone. The streets had long since emptied, leaving only the distant hum of cars and the flickering glow of neon signs reflecting on the wet pavement. The night air was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of rain and the salt of the harbor. Ethan and Grace moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, their breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. They had made a mistake. Earlier that evening, Grace had managed to grab a half-eaten sandwich from behind a cafe. It wasn't much, but food was food. They hadn't noticed the group of older boys watching them from across the street. Now those same boys were chasing them. "Run!" Grace hissed, grabbing Ethan's wrist and pulling him forward. Their feet pounded against the pavement as the shouts of their pursuers echoed behind them. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't fast enough. His body was weaker now. Days without proper meals had slowed him down, drained his strength. And then it happened. His foot caught on a loose piece of concrete, and before he could stop himself, he went down hard, hitting the ground with a painful jolt. The vase slipped from his grasp. Time seemed to slow. He watched, helpless, as it flew forward, spinning in the air before crashing onto the sidewalk. The sound of shattering ceramic cut through the night like a gunshot. Ethan gasped, scrambling toward it. "No! No! No! No!" The footsteps behind them halted, the group of boys hesitating at the sight of the broken shards. One of them snickered. "Well, that's one less thing to worry about." And just like that, they lost interest. They turned and walked away, their laughter fading into the darkness. But Ethan barely noticed. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over the shattered remains of the vase. The pieces glistened under the streetlight, reflecting fragments of his own stunned expression. His hands shook as he reached out, carefully touching the jagged edges, as if hoping he could somehow put it back together. Grace knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. "Ethan?" He didn't answer. Something inside him had cracked along with the vase. It had been the last thing connecting him to his grandfather, the only piece of his past he had left, and now it was gone. His fingers closed around one of the larger shards. The intricate carvings were still visible, the symbols his grandfather had once traced with wise, steady hands. And then, he saw it, a small, aged envelope, tucked inside one of the broken pieces. Ethan's breath caught. "What is that?" Grace asked, leaning in closer. Hands trembling, Ethan carefully pulled it free, brushing away the dust of shattered porcelain. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges slightly curled. His name was written on the front in familiar handwriting, his grandfather's handwriting. Grace's eyes widened. "Ethan, open it." He hesitated for only a second before carefully tearing the seal. Inside was a check for $1 million. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The numbers stared back at him, clear and undeniable, and at the bottom the signature, James Whitmore. Ethan's mind reeled. His pulse roared in his ears. $1 million, hidden inside a vase he had carried through hunger, cold, and endless nights of wondering why his grandfather had left it to him. He looked at Grace, his vision blurring. I don't understand." She swallowed hard. "Ethan, he must have known. He must have known you'd figure it out, but only when you were ready." Ethan let out a shaky laugh, one that wasn't quite joyful, but wasn't entirely bitter either. He thought of all the times he had doubted, all the moments he had almost given up, all the times he had clutched the vase to his chest like it was something precious. Because it was. His grandfather had never abandoned him. He had believed in him. Ethan closed his eyes, pressing the check tightly in his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future. Grace sat beside him on the cracked sidewalk, her breath still uneven from the chaos of the night. She stared at the check, then at Ethan, as if trying to process whether any of this was real. "So," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" Ethan exhaled slowly. The wind coming off the harbor was sharp, sending chills down his spine. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel powerless. He looked down at the scattered shards of the vase, the very thing he had clung to for so long, now shattered, revealing what had been hidden inside all along. He closed his fingers around the check and met Grace's gaze. "We start over." The very next morning, they walked into a bank. The teller eyed them suspiciously, her gaze flicking over Ethan's tattered hoodie and Grace's oversized coat. But when he slid the check across the counter, her expression changed. Within an hour, Ethan's world transformed. By the end of the week, they had a place to call home. The apartment wasn't much. A tiny one-bedroom unit on the edge of town with creaky floors and walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing through. But to them, it was everything. Ethan ran his fingers over the keys when the landlord handed them over, still half convinced this was all a dream. He had spent too many nights sleeping on concrete to believe that he truly had a door to lock, a warm place to return to at the end of the day. Their first night in the apartment, they sat on the floor, eating takeout straight from the cartons. There were no chairs, no table, no furniture of any kind. But there was warmth, and there was safety. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan didn't fall asleep worrying about where he would wake up. But the money, no matter how much there was, wouldn't last forever. Ethan knew that. His grandfather had taught him about responsibility, about not just surviving, but building something meaningful. So as the days passed, he began to plan. While Grace worked on getting her documents in order, so she could finally exist again in a world that had long since stopped seeing her, Ethan spent hours researching, running numbers, remembering the lessons his grandfather had taught him about business, about purpose. And then, one evening, as they sat on the apartment floor, eating yet another cheap meal, Grace glanced at him over her noodles. "You've been staring at your notebook for 3 days," she said. "What's going on in that brain of yours?" Ethan hesitated, then turned the notebook toward her. "I want to open a coffee shop." Grace raised an eyebrow. "A coffee shop?" He nodded. "Think about it. A warm place where people can sit, talk, feel welcome. Not just a business, but a community." Grace leaned in, scanning the scribbled ideas, the rough sketches of a storefront, the financial breakdowns. She let out a low whistle. "You really thought this through, huh? I want to build something that matters." Ethan's voice was steady, determined. "I want to create the kind of place we never had, somewhere people can go when they have nowhere else." Grace was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. "Sounds like something your grandfather would have done." The next few weeks passed in a blur. They found a small shop, a modest space tucked between two larger buildings, with a worn-out sign and a broken doorbell, but it had potential. Ethan poured everything into it. He hired contractors, worked alongside them to fix up the interior, repainted the walls himself. Grace, ever the skeptic, teased him about his perfectionism, but she showed up every day, learning the trade, figuring out the details. And then finally, on a crisp autumn morning, they opened the doors to Whitmore Cafe. At first, it was just a few curious passers-by, drawn in by the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the soft glow of the string lights they had hung by the windows. Then word spread. Customers came, not just for the coffee, but for the atmosphere, the warmth of the place, the way Ethan and Grace made them feel welcome, the way it felt less like a business and more like home. The cafe flourished. Ethan invested wisely, just as his grandfather had taught him. The money from the vase wasn't just changing his life, it was building something that could last. But even as the shop grew, he never forgot where he had come from. On cold nights, he would glance outside and see them, the ones still out there, huddled in doorways, invisible to the world. One evening, he turned to Grace as they cleaned up after closing. "We should do something," he said. Grace glanced at him. "Do something?" "For them," Ethan said. He gestured toward the window, where the city stretched out beyond the glass. "For the people like us, like we used to be." Grace studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yeah," she said, "we should." And so they did. Every night after closing, they set aside meals, coffee, sandwiches, warm pastries. They left them outside, no questions asked. Then, they started doing more. They donated money to shelters, partnered with outreach programs, even opened their doors to those who just needed a place to sit, to rest, to be seen. Ethan had spent months fighting to survive, holding on to a vase he didn't understand, believing in something he couldn't yet see. But now, standing behind the counter of the cafe he had built, watching people come in from the cold, he finally understood. This was never just about the money. It was about what he chose to do with it. 3 years later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the large front windows of Whitmore Cafe, painting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon lingered in the air, wrapping around the quiet hum of conversation. Ethan stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, carefully pouring a latte. This was his life now, his home, his purpose. He no longer counted the days since he had left the streets. He no longer measured his worth by the approval of those who had abandoned him. He had built something real, something lasting. The cafe wasn't just a business. It was a refuge, a place where people felt seen. He had filled it with warmth, not just in the glow of the lights or the scent of roasting beans, but in the way he treated everyone who walked through its doors. Then she walked in. At first, he almost didn't recognize her. The woman standing at the shop's door looked vastly different from the image of the person who had driven him away years ago. Her sharp edges had dulled, her presence no longer filling the space with unyielding authority, but with something else: hesitation, regret. Her once meticulously styled hair was streaked with gray, and the lines on her face were deeper, carved by time and something heavier: guilt. Ethan froze mid-pour, the steaming milk in his hand suddenly feeling heavier. The noise of the cafe dimmed, as if the world had decided to move in slow motion for just this moment. She took a step inside, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Linda swallowed, clasping her hands in front of her, as if steadying herself. "Ethan," she said softly. The sound of his name coming from her lips after all these years felt foreign. He placed the cup down carefully, wiped his hands on a cloth, and met her gaze. "Mom." Something flickered across her face. Pain, maybe even hope. She took another step closer. "I heard about the cafe," she said, her voice thin, as if she wasn't sure how much she was allowed to say. "I heard about everything you've done." Ethan remained silent. He didn't know what she wanted from him. Forgiveness? A place in his life? She let out a shaky breath. I needed to see you. I needed to say..." She hesitated, her fingers tightening together. "I was wrong." Ethan's chest tightened. He had once dreamed of hearing those words, had once ached for them, but now that they were here, they felt empty. Linda blinked rapidly, as if forcing herself to continue. I thought about you every day, about what I did, what I said, and I regret it. I regret all of it. Her voice wavered. I should have fought for you. I should have. She broke off, shaking her head. Ethan let her words hang in the air. He waited to see if she would say what he truly wanted to know. Did she regret losing him, or did she regret losing what he had become? Why now? His voice was even, measured. She flinched as if she hadn't expected him to ask. I was scared, she admitted. I thought you hated me. I thought... She glanced around the cafe. I didn't know how to come back after everything. Ethan exhaled slowly. You didn't try. Linda's lips pressed together, guilt washing over her. Ethan studied her, feeling nothing like the boy who had once desperately searched for her approval. He had spent years thinking that if he was just better, stronger, more successful, maybe she would finally see him. But now he didn't need her to. He had built a life without her, a life filled with love, dignity, and purpose. You made your choice, he said finally. Her eyes shimmered. Ethan, please. He shook his head. I spent so much time searching for love in the wrong places. But the love I was searching for? I found it in those who truly cared, not in the people who turned their backs on me. Linda inhaled sharply as if she had been struck. Her shoulders dropped, her breath unsteady. She nodded once, eyes glassy, before turning toward the door. She didn't beg. She didn't make excuses. Maybe because she knew the truth, that some mistakes can never be undone. As she stepped outside, the golden light of the afternoon fading into the cool blue of dusk, Ethan let out a slow breath. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely free. The cafe bustled with quiet energy, the hum of conversation blending with the soft hiss of steaming milk and the rhythmic tapping of spoons against ceramic cups. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden tables. A faint chill lingered in the air, the kind that whispered of the approaching winter. But inside Whitmore Cafe, warmth lived in every corner. Ethan stood behind the counter, watching as customers filtered in. Some familiar faces, others new. He knew their names, their orders, their stories. This place had become more than a business. It was a home, a second chance, a refuge for those who once felt invisible. Near the back, a group of young men and women huddled over steaming cups of coffee, their backpacks resting at their feet. They reminded him of himself and Grace all those years ago, lost, searching, carrying burdens too heavy for their age. But here, in this space, they had warmth, a meal, a chance. Grace emerged from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, a grin tugging at her lips. The new kid at table 5 just asked if we're hiring, she said, nodding toward a teenage boy, his clothes worn, but his posture hesitant, hopeful. Ethan followed her gaze. He saw himself in that boy. We always are, he said simply. Grace smirked. That's what I told him. It had started small. First, they left out food, a sandwich here, a cup of soup there, for the ones who needed it. Then as the business grew, they hired those who had nowhere else to go, giving them not just a paycheck, but a purpose. And now Whitmore Cafe wasn't just a cafe, it was a community, a movement. Ethan no longer carried the vase, but he kept a single piece, a jagged shard, smooth at the edges where he had polished it down, small enough to fit in his pocket. Some days he ran his fingers over it, tracing the worn carvings, remembering the journey that had led him here. His grandfather had never meant for the vase to be a gift of wealth. It had been a lesson, a test of patience, faith, and self-worth. Ethan had spent years believing he was nothing, that he was unworthy of love, of a future. But James Whitmore had known better. He had known that the greatest treasures in life weren't just given. They were earned through struggle, through resilience, through the quiet decision to keep going, even when the world turned its back. And now Ethan no longer feared tomorrow. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect. Sometimes we are given burdens that feel too heavy to carry, stripped of the comforts we once relied on, and forced to face the harsh reality of being alone. But what if, hidden within those struggles, there was something greater waiting to be discovered? Ethan's story isn't just about a boy who inherited an old vase. It's about resilience. It's about learning that true worth isn't found in what we are given, but in what we fight to become. His grandfather could have handed him wealth on a silver platter, but instead, he gave him something far more valuable: the chance to prove to himself that he was strong enough to rise. How often do we mistake the challenges in our lives for misfortune, only to realize later that they were shaping us into who we were meant to be? How many times have we let the judgment of others define our worth, instead of realizing that we carry something priceless within us? Something that no rejection, no failure, no moment of doubt can ever take away? Ethan's journey reminds us that the hardest struggles often lead to the greatest transformations. That sometimes the love we seek isn't found in those who abandon us, but in those who choose to walk beside us when we have nothing to offer but ourselves. If you have ever felt overlooked, discarded, or underestimated, let this story serve as a reminder. Your value isn't measured by what the world gives you, but by what you discover within yourself. What do you think of Ethan's journey? Have you ever faced a challenge that turned out to be a blessing in disguise? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your story. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you for being part of our journey, and remember, sometimes the most broken things hold the greatest treasures.